The scream cut through the music like a knife through silence. Not the scream of an excited fan, not the scream of someone caught up in the moment. A scream filled with rage and desperation, and something darker. Courtney Love's voice, unmistakable even in its fury, pierced through the wall of sound that Nirvana was creating on stage. September 24th, 1993, the Hollywood Palladium in Los Angeles. 3,000 people were about to witness the most uncomfortable moment in Nirvana's history. Nobody was prepared for what happened next. The show had started like any other Nirvana performance. Raw energy, controlled chaos, Kurt Cobain at center stage doing what he'd done hundreds of times before, playing guitar, singing songs that millions of people knew by heart, being the reluctant icon he'd never wanted to become. Dave Grohl pounding his drums with the precision and power that made him one of the best rock drummers of his generation. Chris Novoselic on bass, providing the foundation that held everything together. The crowd was electric. This was Los Angeles. This was Nirvana's territory. This was supposed to be a celebration. But Courtney Love was in the audience, and Courtney Love was not celebrating. Their relationship had always been volatile, public, messy in ways that fed gossip, columns, and music magazines. They'd met in 1990, before either of them was famous, before Nevermind changed Kurt's life, before Hole's Live Through This would establish Courtney as a force in her own right. They'd fallen for each other hard and fast, the way intense people do. Got married in 1992, had a daughter, Frances Bean, later that year, and proceeded to have a relationship that was equal parts passionate love and destructive chaos. By September 1993, the chaos was winning. Kurt had been struggling. The success of Nevermind had brought wealth and fame and access to everything he'd never had. Growing up poor in Aberdeen, Washington, it had also brought pressure and expectations, and a level of scrutiny that made his already fragile mental health worse. His stomach problems, chronic and agonizing, had led him down a path of pain management that had turned into full addiction. Courtney had her own struggles, her own demons, her own relationship with substances that made everything more complicated, and they were trying to navigate all of this while being two of the most talked about people in rock music. The fights had been getting worse, more frequent, more public, more vicious. They'd fight about Kurt's drug use, about Courtney's behavior, about Frances, about money, about who was more committed to staying sober, about who was a better parent, about the constant media, scrutiny that turned every private moment into public spectacle. They'd fight backstage at shows, in hotel rooms, on the phone when they were apart, and sometimes, like tonight, the fight spilled over into the most public spaces imaginable. Courtney had been drinking. Anyone near her in the crowd could see it. The loose movements, the too loud voice, the aggressive energy that came with being intoxicated and angry. She'd been yelling things at the stage throughout the first part of the show, things that got lost in the general noise of 3,000 people, things that Kurt either couldn't hear or was choosing to ignore. But then, midway through Lithium, she screamed something that everyone heard. The exact words were lost in the chaos. Different people who were there that night remember different things. Some say she screamed about Kurt's drug use. Some say she screamed his name with such venom that it silenced the people around her. Some say she screamed something about Frances, about being a bad father, about choosing heroin over his family. What everyone agrees on is that the scream was impossible to ignore. It cut through everything, and Kurt Cobain, playing guitar and singing at center stage, heard it clearly. His fingers froze on the guitar strings. The chord he was playing rang out, and then died into silence. Dave kept playing for a few bars before realizing Kurt had stopped. Chris followed suit. Within seconds, the music had completely stopped. 3,000 people went from noise to confusion to dead silence in the span of maybe 10 seconds. And in that silence, everyone could hear Courtney Love continuing to scream. Kurt stood at the microphone, guitar hanging from his shoulders, staring out into the crowd, not at Courtney specifically. He couldn't see her in the mass of bodies and darkness, but he knew her voice, knew exactly who was screaming, knew exactly why. The stage lights illuminated his face, and everyone in the first rows could see his expression. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something more complicated, something that looked like resignation mixed with sadness, mixed with exhaustion. For a long moment, nobody moved. The band stayed frozen. The crowd stayed silent. Courtney's screaming had stopped once the music stopped, leaving a void that nobody knew how to fill. Kurt could have done what most performers would do. Ignore it, make a joke, start the next song, pretend nothing had happened and let the machinery of the performance carry everyone past the awkward moment. That's what the promoters wanted, what the venue staff wanted, what probably most of the audience wanted. Just move forward and pretend the moment hadn't happened. But Kurt Cobain didn't do that. Instead, he carefully took off his guitar, set it down on the stage with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his reputation for destroying instruments, walked to the very edge of the stage, sat down, let his legs dangle over the edge, and just sat there, looking out at the crowd, not saying anything, not performing, just existing in the moment as himself, rather than as the person everyone expected him to be. The confusion in the crowd was palpable. People started murmuring. Some were annoyed. They'd paid money to see a show, not watch Kurt Cobain sit on the edge of a stage in silence. Others were curious. This was unprecedented. This wasn't part of any script. This was something real happening in real time. And a small portion of the audience, the people who'd been following Nirvana since before the fame, recognized what they were seeing. Kurt was giving up, not on the show necessarily, but on the pretense, on the performance, on maintaining the illusion that everything was fine. Dave and Chris exchanged looks behind Kurt. Neither of them knew what to do. This wasn't a planned moment. There was no protocol for the lead singer simply sitting down in the middle of a show and refusing to continue. They could hear the venue staff starting to panic, heard whispered conversations over headsets about what to do if Kurt didn't get back up, whether to end the show, whether to try to force the situation to resolve. But for the moment, everyone just waited. Kurt sat there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. The silence stretched, became uncomfortable, became almost unbearable. Some people in the crowd started to boo. Others told them to shut up. Fights almost broke out in the audience between people who thought this was bullshit and people who thought this was important. And through it all, Kurt just sat, staring out at 3,000 people while processing whatever he was processing. Then finally he spoke, not into the microphone, just loud enough for the first few rows to hear. His voice was quiet, tired, empty of the energy that usually filled his performances. He said something that got repeated and passed back through the crowd like a game of telephone. Different versions, different interpretations, but the essence was the same. He said he was tired. He said relationships were hard. He said he didn't know how to be a person and a performer at the same time. He said he was sorry, and then he stood up. But he didn't pick up his guitar. Instead, he walked to where Courtney was standing in the crowd. Security started to move, thinking he was going to confront her, thinking this was about to become an even bigger scene. But Kurt wasn't moving with aggression. He was moving slowly, deliberately. When he reached the barrier between the stage and the audience, he stopped, looked directly at Courtney, and held out his hand. The gesture was so unexpected that nobody knew how to react. Here was Kurt Cobain in the middle of a show, reaching out to his wife, who had just screamed at him in front of thousands of people, offering his hand, not in anger, not in confrontation, in something that looked a lot like forgiveness. Or maybe not forgiveness, maybe just acknowledgement, recognition that they were both damaged people, trying and failing to navigate an impossible situation, recognition that being angry at each other didn't solve anything, recognition that they were both trapped in the same machine that was grinding them both down, Courtney stared at his hand for a moment. The crowd held its breath, and then she took it. Kurt pulled her up onto the barrier between them. They stood there facing each other. And then, in front of 3,000 people, Kurt Cobain hugged his wife. Not a performance hug, not a public display designed for cameras. A real hug, the kind that says, I know we're both drowning, but at least we're drowning together. The kind that acknowledges damage without pretending it can be fixed. The kind that says, I see you and you see me, and that's all we have right now. The crowd erupted, not in boos anymore, in something more complicated. Some people were cheering, some were crying, some were just shocked into noise. This wasn't what anyone had come to see. This was too real, too raw, too human for a rock show, but it was also undeniably powerful. It was two people refusing to perform their conflict for the entertainment of others, refusing to let their relationship be consumed by spectacle, taking a private moment and making it public not because they wanted to, but because every moment of their lives was already public, whether they wanted it or not. Kurt and Courtney stood there in that embrace for maybe 30 seconds. Then Kurt helped her down and climbed back onto the stage. He picked up his guitar, strapped it back on, walked back to the microphone, and without saying anything to the audience, without acknowledging what had just happened, he started playing again. The band followed his lead, and the show continued, as if the previous 5 minutes hadn't happened, as if the world hadn't just watched something intensely personal and uncomfortable and real. But of course, those 5 minutes had happened, and everyone in the Hollywood Palladium that night knew they'd witnessed something significant, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what it was, even if they disagreed about what it meant. They'd seen past the performance, seen past the persona, seen two human beings trying to navigate an impossible relationship in impossible circumstances, while thousands of people watched and judged and consumed their pain as entertainment. The rest of the show was intense. Kurt played harder than before, sang louder, pushed himself further, like he was channeling everything he'd just felt into the music. The confrontation, the reconciliation, the exhaustion of being constantly on display. All of it went into his performance, and the audience, still processing what they'd just seen, responded with an energy that was different from before, less about entertainment, more about connection, like they understood, even if just for a moment, that they weren't just watching a show. They were witnessing real people with real problems trying to make art while falling apart. After the show, backstage was chaos. Venue management wanted to talk about what had happened, whether there had been a security breach, whether Courtney should have been removed from the audience. Record label people wanted to discuss optics, how this would play in the press, whether damage control was needed. Journalists who'd been in attendance were already writing their pieces, some framing it as a romantic gesture, others as a public meltdown, others as evidence of the toxic dynamic between Kurt and Courtney. But Kurt and Courtney weren't backstage for most of these conversations. They'd left almost immediately after the show ended, gone back to wherever they were staying, to continue their fight, or their reconciliation, or whatever came next in private, away from the thousands of eyes that had just watched them, away from the people who would analyze and interpret and consume what they'd just done. Just two people trying to figure out how to be with each other when everything in their lives made being with each other nearly impossible. The Hollywood Palladium show became legendary in Nirvana lore. Bootleg recordings circulated, but the recordings couldn't capture what it felt like to be there. The tension, the silence, the moment when Kurt sat on the edge of the stage and refused to perform. The moment when he reached out to Courtney. The moment when the curtain between performance and reality was pulled away and everyone saw what was behind it. The audio could capture the music stopping and starting, but it couldn't capture the emotional weight of those minutes, the sense that something important was happening even if nobody could quite name what it was. Years later, people who were there that night would talk about it in hushed tones. Some called it the most powerful thing they'd ever seen at a concert. Others called it uncomfortable and inappropriate. Some said it was a perfect example of why Kurt and Courtney's relationship was doomed. Others said it was proof of how much they loved each other despite everything. But everyone agreed it was real, in an industry built on artifice and performance and carefully managed personas. What happened that night was undeniably real. Dave Grohl rarely spoke about it in interviews. When pressed, he'd say it was a difficult night, that watching Kurt and Courtney's relationship play out in public was hard for everyone who cared about them, that being in a band with someone whose personal life was constantly exploding created impossible situations. But he'd also say that the moment when Kurt reached out to Courtney, when he chose connection over confrontation, was pure Kurt, was exactly who Kurt was at his core. Someone who wanted to connect, who wanted to love and be loved, who wanted to be seen as human rather than as icon. Chris Novoselic would later describe that night as emblematic of everything that was wrong with fame. The fact that Kurt and Courtney couldn't have a private fight, couldn't work through their problems away from thousands of witnesses, couldn't just be a couple dealing with difficult shit without it becoming content for consumption. He'd talk about how the machine of celebrity turned everything into spectacle, how even genuinely human moments became products, how Kurt's attempt to have a real, unperformed moment with his wife was immediately commodified and sold and analyzed and turned into just another piece of Nirvana mythology. The press coverage of the Hollywood Palladium show was predictably sensationalistic. Headlines about Courtney screaming at Kurt, about Kurt stopping the show, about their toxic relationship playing out on stage. Some articles were sympathetic, others were cruel. Some tried to be balanced and thoughtful, but all of them turned what had happened into a story, into entertainment, into something to be consumed by people who weren't there and couldn't understand the weight of that moment. The silence, the vulnerability, the choice Kurt made to reach out instead of retreating. What most coverage missed, what most people who weren't actually there couldn't grasp, was that Kurt's response to Courtney's screaming wasn't weakness. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't enabling or dysfunction or any of the other terms that got thrown around. It was a choice, a deliberate decision to respond to public anger with public vulnerability, to answer aggression with openness, to refuse to let their relationship become another piece of rock and roll theater. By sitting down, by reaching out, by hugging Courtney in front of everyone, Kurt was saying something important. He was saying that love, even complicated and damaged love, mattered more than the show, more than the audience's comfort, more than maintaining the illusion of being okay when you're not okay. In the months that followed, Kurt and Courtney's relationship would continue to be rocky. They'd separate and reconcile multiple times. They'd fight and make up and fight again. Kurt's addiction would worsen. Courtney would struggle with her own demons. The media would continue to scrutinize every aspect of their relationship. And eventually, less than 7 months after the Hollywood Palladium show, Kurt would be dead. Suicide on April 5th, 1994, leaving behind Courtney and Francis and millions of fans and countless questions about what might have been different if circumstances had been different, if support systems had been better, if the machinery of fame had been less destructive. Looking back at that September night in 1993, it's impossible not to see it as foreshadowing, as evidence of everything that would eventually go wrong. The public nature of private pain, the inability to escape the spotlight long enough to heal, the way love gets twisted when it's performed for audiences, the exhaustion of constantly being on display. But it's also evidence of something else, of Kurt's capacity for vulnerability even in impossible circumstances, of his refusal to perform when performance felt wrong, of his instinct to reach for connection even when anger would have been easier. That's what happened at the Hollywood Palladium on September 24th, 1993. That's what Kurt Cobain did when Courtney Love screamed at him from the crowd. He stopped. He sat down. He reached out. He chose to be human instead of performing being human. And in doing so, He gave 3,000 people a glimpse of who he really was underneath all the mythology and expectations and pressure. Not the voice of a generation, not a grunge icon, not a tortured artist, just a person trying to love, someone while drowning in circumstances neither of them could control. Just a man who understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop performing and just exist in your pain, where everyone can see it. The tragedy is that being brave didn't save him. Being vulnerable didn't heal him. Choosing love over anger didn't make the circumstances less impossible. 7 months later, all the vulnerability and honesty and reaching out wouldn't be enough. But for one night, in front of 3,000 witnesses, Kurt Cobain showed everyone exactly who he was and the response he chose. The moment when he reached out his hand instead of walking away remains one of the most genuinely human moments in rock history, not because it solved anything, but because it refused to pretend, refused to perform, refused to let the show matter more than the connection.